Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I am Christos Psaltis, Political Officer of the British Embassy in Athens, and I wish to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. Welcome all of those who are joining us on Zoom this evening, and all of those who will be watching the lecture tonight on YouTube, tonight and later than tonight, on YouTube. This is the third in the 1821 lecture series that the British Embassy in Athens is jointly organizing with Tovima, and I wish to thank them once again for their support. Just before we begin, a very brief word from me on the order of the evening for those who are new to the platform and to the way we hold these lectures, and on some technical details. After this brief introduction by myself, Her Excellency the Ambassador will deliver a short address. Then Professor Schoina, whom we warmly thank for her participation tonight, will speak to us on the very interesting subject of Byron's Poetic Revolution. Then there will be a Q&A session, and Professor Schoina will reply to your questions. So with thanks to all involved in tonight's event, and particularly to Professor Schoina, I'm giving the floor over to the Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christos. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Before I begin my short introduction to this evening's lecture, I wanted to take a moment just to remember and reflect on the life of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, who so sadly died on Friday. We've lost an irreplaceable figure in our national life and history. And of course, like Byron, someone who in a very particular and special way links Britain and Greece. And of course, here in Greece, the land of Prince Philip's birth, it's not surprising that there should be a special interest in his passing. But I've been very struck over the last few days, not only by the factual references to His Royal Highness's connections with Greece, but also by the great warmth and admiration for him expressed by many friends, contacts, and members of the public. His distinguished naval service, including in Greece at Cape Matapan and the Battle of Crete, have been remembered. But most of all, his extraordinary support and devotion to Her Majesty have been very widely recognised and appreciated. And I have found that very touching at a time of great sadness and heartwarming too. So thank you. And something I've learned just in the last few days about His Royal Highness, and which I had no idea about, was that he was a great reader and lover of poetry, reportedly having in his personal library very few novels, but over 200 volumes of poems. I don't know if that included the poetry of Byron, but I would imagine that the Byronic hero, of which we will hear Professor Schoina speak in a moment, might well have appealed to him. So with that, let me turn to tonight's event. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all again to our third 1821 lecture on Byron's Poetic Revolution by Professor Maria Schoina, jointly organised by the British Embassy in Athens and Tovima newspaper. We opened the series last year with British historian David Brewer, continued at the start of 2021 with Professors Stefanidis and Gounaris. And we continue what seems to be a flourishing cooperation tonight with the Aristotelio Panepistimiou of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki with Professor Schoina. As you all know, the lectures in this series concern the overall theme of Britain, Britons and the Greek Revolution, and examine different aspects of our old, deep and multifaceted relationship. Of course, events keep impacting our programme and forcing us to change plans from time to time, not only because of the pandemic, but for the best of reasons too, like preparing for the recent royal visit to celebrate the bicentennial. So we have no set dates for the next lectures, but our series will continue, and hopefully sooner rather than later, we will be able to host at least a partly physical event. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very easy to, in a sense, sum up the whole theme of Britons and the Greek Revolution in one word and one name, Byron. It's the name that is always in the back of our minds when we think about our shared intellectual and cultural wealth, our relationship that goes back in time since before the creation of the modern Greek state. And like many others, I could go on for a really long time speaking about Byron, and indeed on other occasions I have. But we are lucky to have with us tonight a real expert who is much better placed to speak about Byron and his poetry than I am. So let me present Professor Schoina briefly. She is Associate Professor of English Literature in the School of English of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, the author of Romantic Anglo-Italians, Configurations of Identity in Byron, the Shelleys and the Pisan Circle, published by Ashgate in 2009, Routledge 2016, and in paperback in 2019. Her essays have appeared in various academic journals and essay collections. Her most recent publications include an essay and contributions on Mary Shelley's Greek studies, on Byron, the Pisan Circle and the Cockney School, and a chapter on Byron's reviewers for the Oxford Handbook of Byron. And she is the organizer of this year's International Byron Conference in Thessaloniki from the 28th of June to the 4th of July. I very much hope I will be able to attend that in person. Like all of you, I'm looking forward very much to listening to her now speak on Byron's Poetic Revolution. Professor Schoina, you have the floor.
Good evening. Kalispera. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very warm introduction, and thank you for the generous invitation to give this lecture today. I'm indeed honored, and it's a great pleasure to be here. The title of my talk is Byron's Poetic Revolution, and please allow me a few seconds to share my presentation with you. Okay. The 200th anniversary of the Greek War of Independence, celebrated this year in our country and around the globe, has duly reminded us of Byron's long trajectory of his relationship with Greece, one that began with the young poet's first pilgrimage in 1809-1811 and poetic rediscovery of modern Greece, and culminated in his involvement in the Greek Revolution and death in Thessaloniki on April 19, 1824. As David Rosell astutely claims, quote, "In the eyes of the West, the poet created Greece twice, first when he put the Greece of Byron down on paper, and later when he played a major role in the liberation of the country," end quote. Biographies of Byron and modern interpretations of his venture in the last 20 years have duly turned their attention to the second, less explored aspect of Byron's relationship to Greece, namely his involvement in the Greek cause and commitment to a people's war of national liberation, providing various frames of reference for reading the poet's political activism. In his important study, Byron's War, Romantic Rebellion, Greek Revolution, Roderick Beaton has recuperated the story of Byron in Greece, partly through the stories of others who played a crucial part in bringing the poet to commit himself to Greece, mainly his fellow poet Percy B. Shelley and Alexandros Mavrokordatos. Beaton convincingly argues that Byron's transformation from the gloomy but rebellious child into the new Prometheus of new man, of the Greeks that is, was a slow but steady process, building up since the Frankenstein summer with the Shelleys in 1816. While I agree that Byron's decision to join the noble struggle, quote, was a tribute to everything Shelley had come to represent in his imagination, end quote, I would like to suggest that what may have also urged him to achieve a novel political awareness and articulate a more nuanced position with regard to the cause of liberty, sprang from the new turn his poetry had taken after 1817 and the events attending this change. Byron's revisionist aesthetic that led to Don Juan, and it is upon this project I'm going to talk tonight, was conditioned by a series of interlocking facts. His discovery of a new style in poetry after 1817, his involvement in the liberal, verse and prose from the South, the cosmopolitan journal initiated in Pisa by Percy Shelley, Leigh Hunt, and Byron himself, and his changing relationship to the public and the publishing world. All these events catalyzed his literary sensibility and thought, leading to a drastic change of his perception of poetry and politics compared to the one he held in his early career. My paper today will offer a modest contribution to what I believe is a rich and underexplored topic, namely the nature of Byron's poetic revolution and how this intertwines with his politics and the wider political milieu of the time. Changes do not take place in a vacuum, but are implicated in the development of a poet's thought. And so in order to arrive at a better understanding of why Byron's take on poetry after 1817 can be seen as revisionist, as reformist, we need to consider points of departure from, as well as continuities with, his first major poetic project, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Childe Harold, a literary phenomenon of the day, and a poem that gave Byron instant fame, was composed in two halves. The first two cantos between 1809 and 1810, that is the two cantos that made Byron the champion of modern Greece, and the second two in 1816 and 1817. According to Catherine Addison, Childe Harold registers the poet's struggle between heritage and innovation. Thus, Byron adopts the Spenserian stanza, which he manages skillfully, but the strictures of the form are not especially conducive to his characteristically expansive and free-flowing discourse. Similarly, in his lamentations over the ruins of decayed Greece, Byron stayed within the lyrical tropes, attitudes, and manners shaped by the tradition of literary philhellenism. However, Byron could express his predecessor's opinions and emotions with an intensity hitherto unknown. His narrator is inclined to passages of intense excitement, during which articulation is fast, emphatic, and cumulative, eschewing the ideal of temperance and impartiality. The poem rises from the same springs that fed his juvenile poetry, strong passions that overflow in effusive expressions of feeling. The major difference, however, between Childe Harold and earlier poems, which flow from similar meditative, reflective processes, is to be found in the nature of the experience, which forms the matter of the poem, and the attitude of the poet toward the external world. In the juvenile poems, for example, in his Hours of Idleness, Byron looks backwards to his memory of scenes from some happy but irretrievable past and makes his sense of personal loss the cause of his emotional outpourings. The process is not only passive, but a retreat from reality. But in Childe Harold, Byron began to participate consciously and actively in the creative act. The poetry is a response to surroundings, treated largely as if present and immediate. Consider, for instance, the intensity of his reactions to the physical appearance of Greece. The famous lines, "Wherever we tread, it is haunted, holy ground. No earth of thine is lost in vulgar mold." The poem develops generally along a pattern of praise for a moving landscape or sight, followed by lament for beauty, spoiled by whatever causes, seen collectively as man, war, death, and time. The desecration and degradation of Greece are the most difficult instances of ruined beauty which the narrator poet must bear. Despite the pillaged Acropolis and the spiritless indolence of the Greeks, who do not take up the cause of their own freedom, reasons enough for despair, the narrator sounds a positive note in his delight over the natural beauty and fertile fields of Greece, to admit in the end that art, glory, freedom fail, but nature still is fair, and to acknowledge Greece as a spiritual home for the world's dispirited. Even though self-knowledge is an inevitable dividend of travel, the more obvious value for Byron lay in the empirical evidence of places, men, and manners that furnished the mind in order to entertain ideas. Furthermore, experience in the broad world became one of his requisites and provided the foundation of fact, which was the basis of poetic truth in Byron's view. When he began to defend his integrity as a poet and his right to show things existent, he recurred for authority to the evidence of the real world. Years later, in August 1820, he told his fellow poet and friend Thomas More, "I verily believe that nor you, nor any man of poetical temperament can avoid a strong passion of some kind. It is the poetry of life. What should I have known or written had I been a quiet, mercantile politician or a lord in waiting? A man must travel and turmoil, or there is no existence." Byron was also one of the first to attempt to substantiate the Greek revival with evidence from the modern Greeks in their own words. Being profoundly committed to learning about another culture and believing in the value of observed realities, Byron immersed himself in modern Greek culture, language, and literature, and made every effort to draw from his knowledge of the country's contemporary reality and to move away from a purely classicized vision of Greece. This emphasis on experience is one that is entirely consistent with Byron's ambitions and aesthetics. Early in the third canto of Childe Harold, in the course of working through his personal grief, Byron begins to arrive at an enlarged understanding of poets and the value of poetry. "'Tis to create, and in creating live a being more intense, that we endow with form our fancy, gaining as we give the life we imagine." Riding on the success of the first two cantos of Childe Harold, the Eastern Tales appeared between 1813 and 1816. Drawing on Oriental settings, heroic stereotypes, and cross-cultural themes, the Eastern Tales, that is, the Giaour, the Bride of Abydos, the Corsair, Lara, and the Siege of Corinth, appealed to the public taste and received a great deal of critical attention, with magazines and newspapers featuring regularly popular passages. These tetrameter verse tales exhibit a poetic brilliance from which Byron needed eventually to escape. His disenchantment with the tales stems from the fact that they do not reflect reality except as they examine the truth of human emotions. The tales are basically self-indulgent in allowing Byron to escape his pressured existence and in adding to his popularity with the reading public. This phenomenal popularity is manifested in, as well as promoted by, all the mainstream reviewing periodicals of the time. Thus, for John Wilson, reviewer of Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, Byron's powers are divinely conceived. His wonder-working influence can generate the sublime in the human soul, and so readers and critics alike resign themselves to his irresistible dominion. Wilson mystifies and idolizes Byron. He says, "We feel as if there were a kind of absurdity in criticizing the power that hurries us along with it like a whirlwind." Some reviewers, however, lamented that the plots of these early romances told one story and included no humor. According to Francis Jeffrey, editor of the most influential reviewing periodical of the time, the Edinburgh Review, Byron represented with a terrible energy those struggles and sufferings and exaltations by which the spirit is at once torn and transported, and traits of divine inspiration or demoniacal possession thrown across the tamer features of humanity. Despite recognizing the compelling energy and fascination of such verse, Jeffrey questions its moral correctness and cautions Byron against its continuation, urging him to employ his poetry upon subjects less gloomy and revolting. We understand that Byron had to tackle the problem of his attitude toward his reading audiences and modern marketplace. When we read his letters and indeed his poems, it is difficult to name a poet more painfully conscious of his reading audience than Byron. From the beginning to the end of his poetical career, Byron is struggling to reconcile his conflicting desires for a reading audience that would give him status and the name and fame of a poet, and contrarily for freedom from the restrictions inevitably imposed by too close attention to audience demands. In the so-called years of fame, 1812 to 1816, Byron was constantly in the public eye, and his reputation was negotiated and manipulated by some of the best-known mainstream British reviewing periodicals of the time, such as Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, the Edinburgh Review, and the Quarterly Review, all of which influenced to a large extent, I would say crucially, the course of Byron's poetic career through a mixture of approbation and stricture. We should bear in mind that the rapidly enlarging book trade and the rise of new and eager audiences during that time called for authoritative voices, and the leading reviews responded duly to that need. The critics felt it was their duty to safeguard the taste and moral integrity of the public, working hard to digest, compress, or rehabilitate the work under review, pointing out and correcting what they thought was indecent, irreverent, or corrupting. Byron became acutely aware of the power of the reviews over his self-conception, as well as of the fatal effects on the creative spirit very early in his career, as evinced in his letters that deal with a hostile reception of Hours of Idleness in 1807. Using Benedict's words from Much Ado About Nothing, "These paper bullets of the brain have only taught me to stand fire," in a letter to his friend Reverend John Becker, Byron poses as a martyr and attempts to diffuse the tension by turning the abuse of the reviewers to his advantage. Quote, "So much the better, they tell me, for the sale of the book. It keeps up controversy and prevents it from being forgotten." End quote. Byron followed the reviews of his works closely, despite his stated disdain for them. "I'm not much interested in any criticisms, favorable or otherwise," he would say. But over the years, it proved that this confrontation annoyed Byron more than he cared to admit at the time. By 1821, he had grown disaffected and disillusioned of literary criticism and demanded from his publisher to cease the communication of all information or opinions concerning his works. As Byron neared the end of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Canto 4, in 1817, his letters express weariness with his poetic enterprise and a sense of its completion. Appropriately, he exorcises Harold, bids farewell to his child of imagination who blocked the way toward the real world, and concludes the work with the acknowledgement that it is fit the spell should break of this protracted dream. In the same canto, in the fourth canto, he is more critical and distrustful of the powers of the imagination that deceive and prohibit truth. The imagination provides refuge from a miserable existence, yet it prevents our facing real things and diminishes our ability to distinguish between fact and fancy. The beings of the mind are not of clay. Essentially immortal, they create and multiply in us a brighter ray and more beloved existence, that which fate prohibits to dull life in this our state of mortal bondage, by these spirits supplied. Crucially, the passage belongs in the context of the closer critical examination of the poetic style of the day, announced in the fall of 1817, when he offered his publisher, John Murray, a summary of his thoughts on Thomas More's long-awaited Lalla Rookh, a poem he had encouraged Moore to publish since the days of their first acquaintance in London. It is evident in his letter to Murray that Byron is disappointed in the poem, and he evades giving the critical pronouncements that Murray waits to hear. Lalla Rookh, however, seems unquestionably to have led him to reflections upon the current state of poetry. Byron outlines the thinking that must have led him to the Beppo experiment and ultimately to the style of Don Juan. With regard to poetry in general, I am convinced, the more I think of it, that he and all of us, Scott, Southey, Wordsworth, Moore, Campbell, I, are all in the wrong, one as much as another, that we are upon a wrong revolutionary poetical system, or systems, not worth a damn in itself. Byron believed that contemporary verse went wrong when it proceeded on a poetical system or on principles. Few scholars or critics regard Byron as a significant poetic theorist, in fact, because he never wrote or even attempted extended prose reflections on poetry or poetics. But even though Byron left no formal statements of his views on poetry in works such as Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, Wordsworth's The Preface to Lyrical Ballads, or Shelley's A Defense of Poetry, we can unravel from his poems and letters, journals, and records of his conversations a set of beliefs about the poet and poem comparable to, though different from, the theory of his fellow romantics. Unlike them, Byron mistrusted the imagination as a means to truth, nor could he submerge the personality of the real self in the poetic self. Perhaps even worse, and in contrast to all his contemporaries, he maintained a firmly skeptical view of poetry and the idea of the poet. One hates an author that's all author, he writes famously in Beppo, or he calls the poets liars who take all colors like the hands of dyers. He says that in the third canto of Don Juan. Byron theorizes poetry only when he's actually carrying out a poetic practice. This is why, Jerome McGann argues, it is in his verse where we should take Byron's measure as a critic. Beppo and Don Juan's ideas about poetry are important exactly because they are framed in aesthetic rather than conceptual terms. And I think that Don Juan can be very well called a literary manifesto to Byron's age. The kind of monological discourse practiced in the Eastern Tales is capable of no development, and as Addison claims, the escape from this impasse was not so much into a different story as into a meta-language which drew attention to the poetry, the speaker, the reader, and the comedy at the heart of their relationships. What was actually needed after the Eastern Tales and Childe Harold was a style through which Byron could express his individual view of the world by embracing the ironies of existence. Anti-romantic to the extent that he could not believe in either the world or man as perfectible, Byron required a verse form that would reflect and accept his vision of the disparity between reality and illusory hope, one that would allow him to laugh at the way things are, rather than weep because they are so. That style Byron achieved in the end by balancing his extreme consciousness of audience demands against an unshakable belief in his poetic vision and determination to express the truth. It was a fortuitous conjunction of events that when his friend Douglas Kinnaird brought with him to Venice a copy of John Hookham Frere's Whistlecraft in 1817. Critics agree that Whistlecraft, a mock heroic imitation of Luigi Pulci's Morgante Maggiore — Luigi Pulci was an Italian Renaissance poet — showed Byron the rewards of transposing into English the ottava rima, with which he was already familiar from the Italian originals. And one effect of Whistlecraft was to set Byron on a further exploration of Italian poetry. These years, 1818 to 1820, stand as the watershed of Byron's poetic development. In addition to the first 5 cantos of Don Juan, he wrote Mazeppa and the Prophecy of Dante, completed Marino Faliero, wrote his memoirs, and began putting down his thoughts on Pope. As Byron began closing down the project of Childe Harold, and with Beppo opening up the project of Don Juan, he declared that I twine my hopes of being remembered in my line with my land's language. Yet he moved to establish his English language credentials by putting himself to school to another language, Italian. It was a move he had begun to make in 1809, when he wrote Childe Harold under the auspices of Ariosto, as he writes in the introduction to Childe Harold. But by 1817, 1818, he was making a much deeper investment in all the classic works of Italian literature. Beppo, published anonymously in 1818, was neither what John Murray nor the reviewers really expected from Byron. But the playful mood and garrulous style were viewed as a welcome change from the misanthropic gloominess. Byron must have taken stock of the reviewers' continuous pressures to alter his style. As he wrote to John Murray, Beppo will at any rate show them that I can write cheerfully and repel the charge of monotony and mannerism. The poem has been duly recognized as Byron's decisive move toward the fashioning of his new idiom, the so-called half-serious rhyme, which drew on Italian and European models, a style he also pursued in Don Juan. While it epitomized the poet's new satirical mode and his desultory style of writing, it famously divided his contemporaries, provoking confused delight and doubt. Beppo exemplifies Byron's investment in world citizenship and his adaptability and receptivity to different temperaments. Byron had heard the story, which forms the basis of Beppo, as a piece of Venetian gossip, another attempt to represent the handing down of a folk memory through oral culture. It satisfied his liking for fact, and the central character being a Venetian merchant turned Turk provided a wonderful opportunity to satirize his own earlier material in the romantic Oriental tales. Indeed, there are many interesting parallels between the story of Beppo and that of the Giaour, yet they appear in the form of a distorted reflection. The heroine, Laura, comforts herself with a lover when her merchant husband Beppo disappears, but when he unexpectedly returns years later at the carnival, dressed as a Turk, she is not discomposed and is soon ordering him to shave off his beard. It is clear that none of the characters in this love triangle has any thoughts of punishment for an erring wife, duels, or divorce. Surprisingly, the three reach some accommodation, as the garrulous narrator, in a beautifully understated ending, reassures his readers that I've heard the Count and he were always friends. Byron's amusement at the general acceptance of adultery as a regular code of conduct implies a criticism of prudish moralistic approaches. Beppo's morality is profoundly subversive and renders the self-contained and patriarchal world of the Giaour implausible. Thus, Beppo's anti-romantic world could be seen as a satiric reconstruction of the tragic world of Hassan and the Giaour, exposing and at the same time allaying its excesses, tensions, and anxieties. Beppo is liberating as a new form of poetic expression for Byron, and it also discharges impressions of the Mediterranean that had not been released in previous poems. Byron had learned from Frere's Whistlecraft that the Italian octave was capable of expressing many moods. Beppo succeeds because Byron treats his English reading audience as one of his correspondents, eager to hear how life goes with him in Italy, and submits himself, his story, his impressions and opinions to the rhythm of the stanza form as facile and nimble as his mind. It is true that as a structural unit, ottava rima can be employed for very different purposes. As Virginia Woolf wrote in her reflections on Don Juan in her diary of 1918, quote, "It's what one has looked for in vain, an elastic shape which will hold whatever you choose to put into it," end quote. Its most important feature is the disjunction built into the structure of the stanza. The keynote is change. Byron, freed from the restrictions of moderation, becomes angry or despairing, ironic, silly, romantic, or simply outrageous, as the story or his thoughts provoke him, and thus his poetry includes more facts of human experience and is more variable as to the tempo of its reading and the mobility and range of its tones. The stanza takes control of both the writer and the material, so that the poem seems to write itself. To turn and to return, the devil take it. This story slips forever through my fingers, because just as the stanza likes to make it, it needs must be, and so it rather lingers. This form of verse began, I can't well break it, but must keep time and tune like public singers. But if I once get through my present measure, I'll take another when I'm next at leisure. The juxtaposition of cultures and identities is explicitly portrayed in Beppo. The poem revolves around the idea of elusiveness and volatility. Social roles, identities, and meanings cannot be fixed, just like the story itself slips through the narrator's fingers. The fundamental polarization between cultural categories, English or Italian, lover or husband, pagan or Christian, is replaced by their peaceable co-presence. In Beppo, the switching of cultures as part of the Venetian carnival is treated as a jocular exchange of roles and a voluptuous release from categories. And there are dresses splendid but fantastical, masks of all times and nations, Turks and Jews, and harlequins and clowns with feet gymnastical, Greeks, Romans, Yankee Doodles, and Hindus. All kinds of dress except the ecclesiastical, all people as their fancies hit may choose. In other words, the making of identity resembles the labyrinth makeup of Beppo, which is a mingling of digressions, contrasts, incongruities, and an enthusiastic encompassing of difference. Byron's Venetian story, as he calls it, emerges as a cultural mosaic, which gathers up dissimilar traits and synthesizes temperaments in a tolerant and even-handed way. Ottava Rima enabled a creative recasting of Byron's role as brooding outsider. His allegiance to England had often seemed questionable to early reviewers, who felt that Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Cantos 1 and 2, had not endorsed British values as wholeheartedly as travel writing by an Englishman ought. Beppo inclined to the continental way of doing things, but was seen as a jet d'esprit. During the first half of 1818, Byron produced no new work. Both Beppo and the fourth canto of Childe Harold had been published in February and April respectively, and Byron waited anxiously in Venice for news of how these pieces were received. Since the style of Beppo was a radical departure from the kind of poetry he had formerly given his readers, he was more than a little concerned that his publisher, John Murray, would be reluctant to publish Don Juan. Byron urged his friend, John Hobhouse, in a letter sent from Venice in November 1818, a letter which also contained the first canto of Don Juan, to seek another publisher if the poem's freestyle would make Murray pause and scandalize his circle. Byron suggested that Don Juan's making at the cross-influence of continental and English traditions accounted in great part for the nature of its freedom. When I say freedom, I mean that freedom which Ariosto, Boiardo, and Voltaire, Pulci, Berni, all the best Italian and French, as well as Pope and Prior amongst the English permitted themselves. But no improper words nor phrases, merely some situations which are taken from life. Byron thought that English writers should see themselves as members of a nation whose destiny was intimately bound up with those of the rest of the world. It is interesting that out of the pantheon of European men of letters he mentions, Byron points out and humbly acknowledges Pulci as the ultimate source of Don Juan's free mode. He says, the first canto of Don Juan is in the style of Beppo and Pulci. Forgive me for putting Pulci second, it is a slip. Ego et rex meos. The use of the Latin phrase reveals Byron's wish to be associated with the Italian poet, insofar as Pulci, inspired by his famous Domestiche Muse, his domestic muses, advocated a natural, wordly style, simple, direct, and not poetic. In contrast to his fellow poets Frere and Merivale, who had softened the abrupt tonal contrasts and improprieties of Pulci's rude genius, and they were highly praised for this, Byron had no intention to sanitize the Italian poet, but chose to convey as a totality Pulci's combination of levity and seriousness. Byron's discovery of the rich potential of the octave rhyme took him to Pulci's epic masterpiece, Morgante Maggiore, the first canto of which Byron set out to translate in 1819-1820, keeping the original meter. The poet's faith in his role as translator, and this is a role that we don't know about Lord Byron, we don't know him as a translator, and yet he was. This is recorded vividly in the letters of the time, showing Byron's fascination with Pulci and tenacity over what the English poet thought was his grand performance. Predictably, in September 1821, and with the end of their relationship already in sight, Byron, in a series of letters, would reproach Murray for withholding the translation from publication. He said, "Why don't you publish my Pulci, the very best thing I ever wrote, with the Italian to it?" End quote. Byron's pride in his achievement and expressed desire to publish the translation in a volume with the rest of his Italianist poetry at a critical moment of his literary career, that is 1820, 1821, intimate his vested interest and faith in Pulci's art and in the dynamic of his own translation. By speaking in Pulci's favor and placing great faith in his own translation of Morgante, Byron rejects those traditions and contemporary systems that impose constraints and rigid doctrines on people's minds and imagination, preferring to align himself with a European Renaissance epic tradition, which allows a poet to be facetious about religious matters and still not incur the charge of blasphemy. In defending Pulci, Byron was in fact defending himself and Don Juan from charges of impiety and immorality. To Byron's frustration, his Pulci didn't make it into print, and the translation did not see the light until the 30th of July, 1823, when it was printed by John Hunt with the Italian to it in the fourth and final number of the Liberal. Byron set out to translate Pulci stanza for stanza and line for line, presenting as directly as his translating skills permitted Pulci's Syrio-comic rhyme. The seeming paradox, namely that he undertook an almost verbatim translation of the original Italian to illustrate poetic freedom, can be explained if we take into consideration Byron's revisionist project in poetry, one which commanded experimentation, compositional license, and a dialectical relationship with continental sources. Byron's insistence on reproducing faithfully the Italian meter and manner must have been driven by his desire to reform English poetry by introducing a different paradigm in terms of style. And the first step toward this end would be to acquaint the English reader with the distinctive traits of the proposed paradigm and its creative, liberating possibilities. Translation, therefore, becomes the mechanism through which knowledge of this new paradigm is transmitted and mediated to a large reading audience. Caroline Franklin is right to point out that fear over the popularity of Beppo and Don Juan was generated by the fact that Byron had transplanted ottava rima burlesque out of the elitist preserve of antiquarians and scholars who could Baudelarize the humor or render it harmlessly quaint into contemporary popular culture. Byron must have been aware of the fact that his Pulci would be more readily accepted at home as a political aesthetic statement rather than judged for its quality as a translation, since Morgante's real challenge was to the dogmatic authority of the established church. And here is an example. Byron's translation of lines 6 and 7 in the second stanza of Morgante, which in the original contains Pulci's invocation to the Virgin in lieu of the typical appeal to the muse, provides a meta-commentary on the poet's current concerns. Byron stays close to the ironic tone of the invocation and renders gracefully the two lines, con dolce rime e stil grato e soave, aiuta I versi miei benignamente, into, with flowing rhymes, a pleasant style and free, be to my verses then benignly kind. But he expands on the desired qualities of the rime through his use of the word free, which doesn't exist in the original, placed strategically at the end of the line. Byron's next original work in ottava rima attacked English expectations in a more sustained way. Don Juan's radical politics and equivocal morality discouraged John Murray from adding his firm's or Byron's name on the poem's title page in 1819. Naturally, the first two cantos raised protests and objections in London. The famous first lines of Canto 1 dramatized the absurdities of the contemporary literary scene and media-ruled modern age, which is clawing the gazettes with cant, and is manufacturing expendable heroes. But the poem is a revolutionary act against the literary establishment too. With Don Juan, Byron pushes language to its limits as Jerome McGann says, and sees the project of lyrical ballads about the English vernacular in a critical light. Not only does the poem traffic in multiple languages, ancient and modern, foreign and domestic, it assembles different specialized idioms, technical terms, poetical diction, and newspaper jargons. In this way, Byron's poetry proposes no limit to the things to be taken up or the kinds of connections they might involve. Don Juan became the battleground where Byron met Murray and his cohorts to shape his final poetic principles, as well as the arena where Byron hit back at the reviewers after years of silence. His London publisher was horrified by the confrontational nature of cantos 6 to 9 and said he could not publish them. He was even more horrified by Byron's association with the Hunt brothers and his involvement in the publication of the Liberal. In October 1822, alarmed by the prospect of a total break with a poet who had made him rich, Murray would make a last effort to reason with Byron. Never since I have been a publisher did I ever observe such a universal outcry as this work has occasioned, and it is deemed to be no less dull than wickedly intended. Really, Lord Byron, it is dreadful to think upon your association with such outcasts from society. It is impossible, I'm sure, that you can conceive anything like the horrid sensation created in the mind of the public by this connection, unless you were here to feel it. The letter's dramatic tone reveals Murray's rage and confusion at the new direction Byron's poetry had taken while the poet had been in Italy, as well as his lordship's insistence on getting his increasingly controversial Italianized poetry into print. More importantly, though, Murray seems to turn Byron's alignment with the liberal project into a universal concern, central to the fortunes of Britain's well-engineered, though vulnerable, contemporary publishing network. Byron's alignment with the Liberal, which the reviewers had dubbed the Italianized Cockney magazine, certainly caused quite a stir and in large measure influenced the course of his actions after 1822. As Beaton has suggested, after the failure of the Carbonari, here was another way for Byron to attempt to convert words into things and to contribute directly to the political life in England. Founded in Pisa in 1822 by Percy Shelley, Lord Byron and Leigh Hunt, this short-lived publication, dubbed in its own time one of the most curious and interesting miscellanies ever published, discloses a wealth of literary exchanges, but also a battle over the meaning of liberalism, which emerged in the negative criticism the journal received. The implications for its contributors were several and far-reaching. However, Shelley's death on the 8th of July 1822 precipitated a series of complications. The transference of the group to Genoa, the open conflict between Byron and Hunt, and Byron's withdrawal from the scheme, which all presaged the dissolution of the periodical while it was still in its infancy. Nevertheless, recent reappraisals of the Liberal look at the periodical as a politically and intellectually coherent and forward-looking project rather than as a fruitless intervention, arguing for the Liberals' reformist program for freedom and tolerance on an aesthetic, intellectual, political, and religious level. In the spirit of literary free-thinking and thematic open-mindedness, the Liberal vaunted an extraordinary miscellany of genres and styles: poetry, essays, short stories, travelogues, epigrams. Byron's contributions were normally designed to set the tone and act as a focal point for each of the 4 issues, though in practice this proved untenable. The journal promoted within its pages the internationalist tendencies of its writers, advancing cosmopolitanism, multilingualism, intellectual community, a dialectical relationship with continental sources, and translation as the new international aesthetic. If we are great admirers of Voltaire, we are great admirers also of Goethe and Schiller. If we pay our homage to Dante and Milton, we have tribute also for the brilliant sovereignties of Ariosto and Boccaccio. This is from the preface to the first issue of the Liberal, which was written by Leigh Hunt. Though the literary collaboration was greeted with apprehension, sarcasm, and suspicion by the Lake poets and the Mare coterie, Byron, Shelley, and Hunt were all greatly inspired by the prospect of a joint periodical publication, though for different reasons. While Byron was the least optimistic of all, he was hoping that the journal would enable him to get his work published, regain control of the publication process itself, and monitor the editorial production of his poetry. Byron clearly felt that his own liberalism could be aligned with that of the new journal, and the death of Shelley and its unfair treatment in the Tory press strengthened Byron's determination to dedicate his energies to the periodical and devote his poetry to an ideological war against the Tory administration, the Lake poets, and the imperialism they supported. Byron's war was fought in various combat zones, the pages of the Liberal, the later cantos of Don Juan, in the particular Ottava Rima style, and his correspondence with his publisher and London friends, all fired at Britain from Pisa and Genoa. But Byron was astonished and dispirited by the continual declamation against the Liberal by all parties, literary, amicable, and political. Looking back at Byron's life and career from 1832, Mary Shelley claimed that the last cantos of Don Juan were written with great speed. I copied them. The opposition he met concerning the Liberal made him defy the world in Don Juan. Then it made him despise the Liberal itself, so that when he wrote expressly for it, he wrote tamely. But in the end, this war gave him a disgust to authorship, and he hurried to Greece to get a new name as a man of action. This is Mary Shelley. To a large extent, the cynicism and disillusionment of Don Juan reflect the climate of opposition and hostility Byron encountered in what he considered to be an illiberal, hypocritical world. An instance of this practice is the following slashing piece on Byron's Heaven and Earth, which was published in January 1823 in the Liberal, in the high-profile Gentleman's Magazine. Perhaps this giant in poesy considers his name so firmly established that whatever flows from his pen should be received as poetic law. If so, it is the duty of legitimate criticism to expose those licentious aberrations to which his lordship, probably through negligence alone, is frequently liable. Such doggerel trash as this is a disgrace to the writer and an insult to the public. At the same time, however, and this is quite remarkable, it seems that the critics' attacks and Byron's need to fight them energized his creativity and strengthened his defiance. As Franklin points out, despite the failure of the Liberal itself, the attempted collaboration inaugurated one of the most intense periods of inspiration of Byron's life. Complex or divided as his affiliations may have been, the poet must have perceived that the journal was a space of intellectual fermentation and struggle, a testing ground for new ideas, a laboratory for new words which might inspire the minds of readers. By May 1822, Byron's faith in the power of the word had not subsided, and he appeared readier than ever to oppose tyrannical authority head-on and resist unjust power. Byron's letter to Kinnair on the 2nd of May 1822, written while the composition of the 7th canto of Don Juan was at full steam and publication plans for the Liberal were underway, sheds further light on the poet's conception of a poet's duty. Byron famously declared, "As to myself, I shall not be deterred by any outcry. They hate me, and I detest them. I mean your present public, but they shall not interrupt the march of my mind, nor prevent me from telling the tyrants who are attempting to trample upon all thought that the thrones will yet be rocked to their foundation. It is Madame de Stael who says that all talent has a propensity to attack the strong." This powerful passage bears a strong correspondence to the speaker's declaration in stanza 24 of Don Juan, Canto 9, "And I will war, at least in words, and should my chance so happen, deeds, with all who war with thought, and of thought's foes by far most rude, tyrants and sycophants have been and are. As in the letter, Byron locates thought's foes in the contemporary political scene. But the interest of this passage lies also in the evocation of Madame de Staël. French revolutionary activist and theorist of European Romanticism, de Staël supported without fail free intellectual exchange and expression and related this to the political environment. Her work of literature, published in 1800, in fact, stresses the potential for words to have a moral impact and for people of intellectual cultivation to deploy their oratory and writing so as to influence the political process. Thus, of literature exhorts writers keen to have a beneficial moral influence on their audience to not give up hope. As de Staël writes in that work, the only literary force that can make unjust rulers tremble is noble expression, independent inquiry, which judges in the court of reason all the institutions and all the beliefs of mankind. For both Byron and de Staël, their interpretations of and hopes for the contemporary political scene in France, in England, and in Europe were closely connected to their conceptions of the power of language and of the human mind. Byron's keen opposition to tyrannical authority closely resembles de Staël's desire to attack political regimes hostile to intellectual freedom. This is, in fact, the great moral of Don Juan, exposed in Canto 9. I wish men to be free, as much from mobs as kings, from you as me. The idea that all talent has a propensity to attack the strong points to a potentially direct political role for the writer, who could effect change through their work. With his Ottava Rima works, original and translated, Byron finds himself at the crossroads artistically. Being attended by oppressive networks of tradition, production, and reception, the poet defies literary convention and dismantles binary thinking, looking for different opportunities in the English vernacular, as well as creative, political, and religious independence in the liberal and liberating spaces of European cultures. The liberal appeared at precisely the moment at which Byron's revisionist project in poetry was gaining momentum, and would serve as one of its principal conduits. Association with the liberal, and more importantly, the outcry against the periodical's free thinking and cultural pluralism, strengthened the poet's opposition to oppression and injustice, and aroused his interest in the current political affairs of Italy and Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Schoina, for what I'm sure everybody thought was a fascinating presentation of Byron's poetic work, and helped us, at least the non-experts among us, see Byron not just a fighter for the freedom of Greece, but also a poetic warrior, who in his ironic, romantic, outrageous, revolutionary poetry and his mobility and range of tones
Everything all right?
Apologies, I lost my signal for a couple of minutes there, but thankfully it returned. So sorry. I don't know if we have questions. Okay, I see no questions from the public, in which case, Professor Schoina, thank you once again. Apologies for my short absence due to technical reasons. And we hope to meet you soon in Thessaloniki, as the ambassador said before. Thank you and good night to all.
I think there is a question.
Two questions,
Jennifer
actually.
Wallace, am I right?
Yes. Do you see them, Professor?
Yes,
Okay.
I do. Yes.
Go ahead. We're still on. So.
Actually, I can't see Professor Wallace's question. Maybe she wants to speak, but I see a question by Jonathan Wilson. So Mr. Wilson asks if I believe there were specially matched qualities which brought Byron and the Hellenic freedom movement together. Well, as I have argued, a number of reasons brought Byron to Greece. It's not easy to answer the question as to what brought him to Greece, but this is actually what we have been, what scholars have been trying to deal with for a number of years. One of the reasons, as I have argued today, was that his life in Italy and his change in the way he perceived of poetry brought on a very different perception, a very different perception of a poet's duty and of poetry in general. So I think that this freedom in poetry actually made him want to pursue freedom in a more general sense. And it was also, I think, an act of resistance on his part. I mean, he was resisting the tyranny of those who prevented him from expressing himself in the way that he wanted to express himself. And so that was, tyranny in a more general term. Professor Wallace, thank you for your question. The Homeric helmet before setting off for Greece. Yes, I think that, I mean, we all know that Byron was, he had a particular kind of theatricality. I mean, he performed, and his roles, his characters are actually versions of himself, and you can see Byron himself acting in a number of cases. So I think that his wearing the Homeric helmet and his, whenever he went, he carried the whole entourage, and with his horses and animals and pets. So all of this was also, I think, an act of self-parody. As I argued today, I think that one of the aims of this, one of the targets of this new direction in poetry was actually his former poetry. So it was self-parody. It was an attack against himself too. All right. Okay, I'm going to go on with the questions. When it comes to the Shelleys, Professor Hadzis, how did the Shelleys react to his turn? Percy Shelley, in fact, admired Don Juan. He, if I'm not mistaken, what he wrote in a letter was that Don Juan was pregnant with immortality. So he saw a lot of potential in that new turn in Byron's poetry. Yes, as you say, Percy was mesmerized by this. I guess they were they didn't agree with him on other matters that had to do with his behavior and relations to other people. But on this note, I think that they were, Shelley was fascinated. Question from Professor Beaton. I think that Don Juan and the liberal, I think that his commitment to Don Juan and the war he gives, the war he fights, canto by canto, not only against John Murray and his London friends, but also against the reviewing industry of the time, is it's an early projection of the war that he will give later. So the war begins, I mean, even before arriving in Greece and taking up, a real cause, the war has already begun. And I think that what happens in Italy during that time and his investment in the liberal also help him achieve a more nuanced awareness of what poetry is and what poetry should do. So I think it is an ongoing process. I think that both Don Juan and the liberal project, even though, as I said, it is perceived to be, quite. It died in its infancy, as they said. I mean, it was only 4 issues, and yet the mere preparation of it and the first issues and the collaboration with Shelley and Leigh Hunt and all the other writers prepared the ground for his action later. So the political activism was in a way prepared by a kind of intellectual activism, and I see the two deeply interconnected. From Dr. Protopapas, well, I think that the accusation that he received, that he belonged to the satanic group of poetry, that was launched by Robert Southey. I think that Don Juan would come to confirm the accusation, and it was in the dedication of Don Juan, which of course it was not published at the time, that Byron would take issue with Robert Southey. One can very easily interpret these moves, these actions as actions of revenge. It's as if Byron wanted to take it out on those people who had offered those scathing, slashing critiques, and so I think that Don Juan actually galvanized the atmosphere. Yes, and there is another question by Stefan Alexandru. You mentioned Byron's skeptical view of poetry. I was just wondering if his criticism, when he called them liars, was inspired, at least to some extent, by ancient thought on the issue. And you mentioned Plato. Well, I think that Byron was ambivalent. Yes, I did quote that line from Don Juan, that poets are liars, and that, like the hands of dyers. But if you go to the next stanza, you may actually come up with a different idea about what a poet is. I'm not sure he borrows these ideas from Plato. I'm not sure that Byron would actually, that he could actually identify some of his ideas or see his ideas in Plato's ideas, but he did express skepticism and doubt as to the poet and poetry. And what made him express this kind of doubt was the pressing feeling that, you know, one must act. Action is what matters. Action is what counts. And I think that was a constant concern and a constant drive as well until the end of his life. I think I have responded to all the questions. I'm not sure if there are more.
I see no more questions. So anyone for a last question, perhaps? No.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much once again, Professor Schoina, and thank you all for joining, and particular thanks to those who asked these interesting questions. Thank you all very much. Have a nice evening.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Mr. Psaltis, for the coordination. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.